That is President Biden speaking in Madrid to reporters at a news conference ahead of a NATO meeting. We have complete coverage and analysis from Washington right now with our Joe Khalil and Niall Stange. Joe, we're going to start with you. Obviously, that answer to the last question about changing the filibuster so that there could be some overturning of Roe v. Wade from the Supreme Court, saying that that's the one thing that is backwards in America. Strong words from the president.
Yeah, he said the recent behavior of the court with these decisions is outrageous and destabilizing. And he made some news there by saying that he does support not overturning the filibuster, but he said making an exception to the filibuster for this decision. Now, the House, we know, is Democrat majority, would pass something like that. But in the Senate, that would be what it would take. You would need to overturn that filibuster to get a Roe v. Wade bill passed in the Senate. Now, that doesn't mean that it's certainly going to happen. We know that there are two senators on the Democratic side. We've said their names a lot, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, that have been very clear about not wanting to get rid of the filibuster in any way. But you may remember there was a bill earlier in the year where they made one exception to the rule. You have to vote to do that. So that is what President Biden was calling for. And there was obviously a lot there when we talk about the NATO summit. But the answer to that question, Adrienne, I think is going to dominate now the headlines, that the president fully threw his weight behind doing that. Now, we know this comes after calls from pro-choice activists on the White House to do more. They felt, many of them, like this administration wasn't putting up enough of a fight to push back against the decision that the Supreme Court made to overturn it. This would certainly be a major step in that direction. And this is the first time that we've heard President Biden specifically and explicitly call for something like that, Adrienne.
Yeah, and he said a lot of things that are of interest to the American people. Niall, I want to bring in his comments about the Finlandization of NATO versus the NATOization of Finland. Obviously, Finland and Sweden, the president having to correct himself, naming Switzerland as one of the countries, but he did catch that error, that wanted to join NATO at this time. Finland, the happiest country in the world, the country of 1,000 lakes with a great reputation. Was he inferring that Russia would think that NATO was just going to play nice, but now they're playing hardball?
Well, he did talk about the fact that he believed that Vladimir Putin believed the West in general would fracture. And a lot of his scripted comments, rather than in response to reporters' questions, were about this idea of America meeting the challenge and the West more broadly meeting the challenge. Now, a couple of things I would say against that, Adrienne. The Finlandization of NATO isn't a great bumper sticker heading into the midterm elections. I mean, that's not something that is likely to have any real political leverage here at home. And the other point is that when he was asked about gas prices, and that's the domestic issue that is most closely linked to the war in Ukraine, he said that American consumers should accept higher gas prices for as long as it takes. That is a defensible policy position. It's a very difficult political position to make work when so many people are hurting because of gas prices and inflation more broadly. To me, that sounded like an unscripted remark that might come back to haunt the president to some extent.
Or specifically shoot him in the foot and the entire Democratic Party, as there are a lot of people who may tire of the prioritization of Ukraine over American interests right now at this very volatile and tender time. I want to ask you, when he was talking about the number of tanks, over 600 of them, and the repositioning of U.S. troops as well as all NATO troops in places like Romania and Spain, does this mean war?
Well, we hope not. I mean, I think everyone hopes not. The president and the administration generally has tried to thread this kind of fine needle of supporting Ukraine as much as possible without getting into the kind of escalatory spiral that would cause an all-out war in which America would be involved. He has been quite firm that he will never send U.S. troops into Ukraine. But again, Adrienne, I think the bigger picture here briefly is that while we in America have been distracted by a whole lot of other very pressing things, Russia has made advances in eastern Ukraine. We have been naturally consumed with gun crimes, with abortion, with the January the 6th hearings. Meanwhile, the Russians have got rolling a little bit in eastern Ukraine, and that was always the danger from the Ukrainian perspective, that the American public in particular would begin to lose interest or revert to other priorities rather than getting or keeping emotionally engaged in that fight.
Let's go back to Joe. Obviously, the president doubling down on his statements that if Russia made a move, then he told Putin he would make a move with enforcing or rather expanding NATO. But to blame all high gas prices and all high food costs on the Russian war, quite a statement. Maybe not a departure from what we've heard from the president before, but he's certainly pointing all fingers to Russia.
Yeah, he is. Absolutely, Adrienne. And that's something that we've heard from this administration before, wanting to focus that blame on Russia. And certainly the president's critics will point out that while that may be part of the contributing factor to higher prices here, that there are certainly a number of others. And again, the president's critics would point the finger at the administration as well and having a hand at that. I think that goes back to what Niall was talking about, which is that the president has made this commitment, along with the other G7 countries, to maintain their support for Ukraine indefinitely. That was one of the big headlines that came out of the G7 summit. And so now you have this NATO commitment that they're going to be standing by Ukraine. The president, again, talking about how Vladimir Putin had an expectation that a weakened NATO was not going to respond in the way that it did. And the president, I mean, if you really can sum up the entire speech in one theme, the prepared remarks anyway, it's that Russia has done the exact opposite of weaken NATO. They have, in fact, strengthened NATO. And that's when he referenced that statement he made about the, Finlandization of NATO. Instead, what you have is a NATOization of Finland. I'd agree with our friend Niall. That maybe doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, but that's something that the administration is pointing to as a strength, saying that we have mobilized NATO. So I think that's where this comes in, Adrienne. But of course, there are certainly going to be costs domestically. And so the president looking at those costs and saying that the blame for food shortages, for prices going up, for gas prices going up, pointing the finger of blame squarely at Russia. Obviously, there are a lot of people who disagree with that here domestically.
Well, there's the issue with the China shutting down cities, major cities, and the shortages they were seeing there. There's the fact that we still have 2 years of COVID relief or resuscitation, whatever. We need to come back to life in so many ways. But again, Joe and Niall, this conversation will continue. I think that the president's targeted remarks or prepared remarks were eclipsed by that Roe v. Wade conversation towards the end of his news conference.
Adrienne, can I add something?
Absolutely,
if we have time?
you can, yeah.
You brought up China, and so I wanted to talk about it because I feel like after the speech here and the questions about Roe v. Wade, this may get lost on people. But I thought the president said a couple of really important things that may get washed away. He referenced China quite a bit. We're talking about a war with Russia, but he referenced China a lot. And there's an initiative that China has right now for the past couple of years where it's been investing in countries in Africa and then making demands of those countries. The president, I think for the first time we heard, compared the U.S. and saying that the U.S. is going to invest in countries like Angola, except our investment, NATO's investment, will be done with transparency and will be done in a way that is above board. Again, people might have missed that, but that was a direct statement to China and to Xi Jinping, because that shows that the U.S. and NATO has its eye on Russia right now for its behaviors and its invasion in Ukraine, but also keeping an eye on China. And I thought it was surprising how often the president referenced the behaviors of China as well as Russia, because certainly that's a statement, and you can be assured that Beijing is paying attention to that.
Niall, you were nodding your head while Joe was speaking.
Well, I generally nod my head when Joe is speaking because he's generally right about things. But particularly on that point, I agree that actually there was a central thrust of the president's prepared remarks talking about China and the risk posed by China. And this has been a theme of the Biden presidency. He really does see China, I think, as the long-term most dangerous challenger to the United States' primacy in the world. And he mentioned that at the top of his remarks, that he wanted the US and the West to, of course, deal with the immediate challenge from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but at the same time address what I think he called the systemic or the systematic challenge from China. And the kind of investments that Joe alluded to, they're very much part of that picture, trying to counterbalance what is in effect Chinese expansionism, an attempt by Beijing to try to extend its sphere of influence. It's very reminiscent in some ways of the Cold War, except fought strictly in economic terms. And I thought that President Biden did put a lot of stress on that in today's remarks.
Oh, there was a lot spoken of, and we covered a lot of bases right here. Gentlemen, thank you both for all of this. We'll continue the conversation here on Morning in America. But thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.